And welcome to today's webinar, a Q&A with Andrew Ng and Roy Bahat on AI transformation. I'm Linda Lee, talent partner at AI Fund. We're so excited you're all here to join us today. AI Fund is a venture studio, and we work with entrepreneurs as a minor co-founder to build AI-based companies rapidly and increase their odds of success. Now, let me introduce you to our presenters today. Roy Bahat is the head of Bloomberg Beta, an early-stage venture capital firm that was first to focus on the future of work and on artificial intelligence. Roy also chairs the Aspen Business Roundtable on organized labor and serves on the faculty at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. Andrew Ng is a globally recognized leader in AI, and he founded AI Fund in 2018. Additionally, he's also the founder of deeplearning.ai. He's also the chairman and co-founder of Coursera and an adjunct professor at Stanford University. I'll hand it over to you, Roy.
Thank you, Linda and Andrew and team and everybody for being here. So we're just going to jump right in and try to locate us first, Andrew, in this moment, because you have a long arc with AI. And so maybe help us figure out, these two simple letters that we've kept repeating, in our case as a firm since 2014. What is special about this precise moment from the perspective of a big company trying to figure out what to do about AI?
I think over the last decade, the set of tasks that AI could do has been constantly getting bigger and bigger. I don't know what's the rate of increase. Is it growing, 50% year on year for the last 20 years or something? That's a made-up number. But I think that the set of opportunities for companies to automate or augment many things using AI is bigger than ever before. And this creates, upside opportunities and downside risks. So I feel like the sophistication with which different businesses approach AI will have a material impact to their long-term health and future. And because AI is a general purpose technology, like electricity, right? I'll say, if I ask, what is electricity good for? It's useful for so many things, it's always hard to say what it's useful for. And AI is like that too. So a lot of the exciting work for a lot of businesses ahead is to identify the use cases for AI in the specific context of your business so that you can execute a build versus buy versus invest kind of decision to get the job done.
Yeah, so I love that way of putting it, because we are on this steady curve where, from the perspective of an executive, it's always the number of tasks is going to be increasing. And we know that it's much wider now than it was. I mean, very helpfully, the name of the technology that has been most exciting recently is, has general purpose in the name. And I guess the question then is, if I'm sitting there as the general manager of a business unit, or the head of a function, or even the CEO of a mega corporation, how do I do that work to figure out which tasks to prioritize?
Yeah, I think for the C-suite of large corporations, I would give three pieces of advice. First is every knowledge worker today can get a meaningful productivity boost using AI, using generative AI, but people will need a little bit of training to use it safely and effectively. So I would say if you manage a team that includes many knowledge workers, not to exclude people that aren't knowledge workers, but it's just really clear, every knowledge worker right now, today, I think should be using generative AI, but to provide a little bit of that training to get that lift. That's a short-term thing. Looking a little bit further out, I think my friend Eric Brynjolfsson and some of his collaborators at WorkHelix and elsewhere, and I think Roy, I think given your deep involvement in the future of work, I know you're one of the world experts in this as well.
Well, and I think one of the companies that we're both fortunate to be investors in together. So somebody we both pay attention to. But sorry.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. WorkHelix. Yeah. So, I think jobs are bundles of tasks, and I've seen for many businesses, if we systematically analyze what are our people doing, what are the tasks they're doing to figure out which tasks are amenable to AI augmentation or automation, that often then drives a lot of ideas for upside value, at least cost savings, but more often than one would expect, upside value generation as well. And then I think, in addition to analyzing specific work done by the corporation today, I've actually been working with quite a few businesses, large businesses at AI Fund, to do a more systematic brainstorming process to see what are the new opportunities for AI. The thing about AI is, I feel like as an AI person, I have a decent grasp of technology, but I'm not simultaneously a subject matter expert in healthcare and financial services and, logistics and so on and so on. All these sectors to which AI should be applied. And I found that when a subject matter expert in these domains, knows a little bit about AI and drives a systematic brainstorming process that almost always results in a ton of exciting and valuable ideas. Frankly, pretty much everyone we work with, we end up with more what feels like valuable ideas than any of us have time or bandwidth or whatever to do all of. And that, I think, is a recipe to help businesses select and execute on projects that can create meaningful upside.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the differences that we see when we talk to corporations is, unlike some past generations of technology, unlike, say, the big data moment or cloud, this is a technology that each person can develop the intuition for on their own. And in that sense, it's a little bit like mobile, a little bit like the internet. And the analogy that I've heard, and I'm curious if this lands with you, is that AI is like riding a bicycle. You can't learn it without actually doing it. And I think we do have a plague in corporations of many people who would rather tweet about the process of riding a bicycle than actually get on the bicycle and figure out where it can go. And I'm curious what intuitions you see people developing. You mentioned training. And it's, I'm curious, what does that training actually, do you think, need to look like for people inside of corporations?
Yeah, so I think actually the fastest growing course on Coursera last year was something offered by deeplearning.ai, which is generative AI for everyone. So quite a lot of people have taken that. Oh, I
Yeah.
actually know multiple CEOs that went to the executive team and got like the top 100, 150 executives across the entire company to go do generative AI for everyone. And I saw that very quickly, with 3.5 hours of video, leveled up the thinking of the entire executive team on generative AI. And then, as you say, Roy, I actually agree. For a lot of these, what feels like intellectual tasks, like writing prompts or using generative AI, is much more like riding a bicycle or playing tennis or something like that. We have to practice and hone intuitions, because you can hear someone like, one of us talk about what AI can and cannot do, and that sets a useful high-level framing. But until you're there, trying to balance on the bicycle, until you're there writing prompts and seeing what it does well, what it doesn't do well, it's hard to hone those intuitions just by hearing other people talk about it.
I think that's right. And the interesting thing I also think is that this is, in terms of cost, relatively cheap. I mean, my business partner, James Cham, who's been a partner of mine from the beginning, likes to say you could hire a consultant for a week or give 1,000 employees access to pick your model, the pro version of any model, for a year. And you're much more likely to get something out of the experimentation. I also think there's something psychological happening. And I'm just curious to get your empathy with the psychological process happening for executives, because we've all seen when they begin to use it and they say, well, I tried to get it to write a first draft and it was terrible, or I had a hallucination and it hallucinated something and therefore it was bad. It reminds me of this story when pinball machines were first introduced. LaGuardia, Fiorello LaGuardia, was mayor of New York, described them as this, scourge on society, that everybody had to get rid of all the pinball machines. And we're not quite having that moment of panic occasionally in the press, but we do have dismissal. And so I'm just curious how you think about overcoming the psychology of dismissal that executives or advocates, I mean, my guess is the people listening to this webinar are not the skeptics, they're the advocates, but they run into the person who says, oh, but I tried it and it didn't work. And so how do you think about overcoming that roadblock?
So I feel like, boy, honestly, if large company CEOs are being dismissive of generative AI, I don't know. I think someone's going to short their stock of their public. I'm not. I really would. I think that's such an awful idea at this moment in time, especially for a knowledge worker industries, for industry that do knowledge work. And I feel like there is a standard corporate change management playbook where encourage teams to use it, encourage people to have little successes, celebrate their small or large success. But even if you celebrate small success, creates a critical foundation to then let them go on to do something bigger and bigger. I worry much more about companies failing by going too big initially than failing by going too small. So
Right.
when we work with large corporations, we often try to look for quick win projects, something can execute quickly, maybe just a slight positive ROI, but that creates the learnings that then
Are there example areas or functions where you think those are more likely to happen right now?
Um, So because AI is general purpose technology, it really affects all functions, but I find that the companies and the job functions are more digital on average, tend to be adopting it a little bit faster. But I find that the capability and skill or will of the individual actually matters more than the nature of the industry. I
I
think
love that.
businesses more digital just have more likely to have sophisticated IT support, sophisticated ways of understanding data security and what to do, and there's actually one other thing that's interesting, which is there's a lot of hype about how companies are spending hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe someday billions of dollars, to train these models. And people think it is so expensive, and companies are spending, billions of dollars on GPUs. So there is part of AI that is very capital intensive, very expensive. Oh, Sequoia just wrote an article about the $600 billion hole, right? And that is, it is true that parts of AI are incredibly capital intensive. What not everyone really appreciates is because some other people have spent these billions of dollars.
We have
If
a
you want,
peace dividend.
yeah, if you want to build an application,
Yeah,
it is actually very capital efficient. So AI
that's
fund,
right.
we spend $55,000 to build a prototype, and then we invest $1 million to expect the company to start to get real customer traction. So given others have spent so much money building this wonderful infrastructure to people that don't want to compete with those companies, but want to just build applications, it's actually very capital efficient.
Yeah, I think the same is true for startups. And I'm going to ask you about, I'm going to stay on the big companies and their own internal work and ask you about partnering with startups in a moment before we open it up for questions. But I think that in addition to that low expense of building applications or trying, also a wealth of self-education resources out there. I mean, everything from everybody's using these things at home, not everybody, but many people at home for one purpose or another, or their kids are, to, you mentioned coursework like through Coursera, deeplearning.ai. We have invested in a company called Charter that's done a number of research studies, pulling out case studies from various companies and how they're trying to attempt to find new uses of AI. And so I think that we're in this Cambrian explosion period of experimentation, at least as you say, in the companies whose stocks nobody should short. And so now let me ask you to fast forward a year, because everybody is going to enter an annual planning cycle at some point where they'll be in a negotiation process over setting expectations in a corporation. And so we'll all think about quick wins and setting expectations that you can exceed. But for a company that is truly excellent, if I were a board member of a big corporation, and you're a board member of Amazon, I believe, maybe some other large corporations, if I were a board member of a large organization and I wanted to ask, are we doing a good job on AI 1 year from now? What do you think I would be asking?
Yeah, but I'm not speaking for any
No, of course, I'm not trying to, and Amazon's a special case. I'm not asking actually about the technology companies. I'm mostly asking about, as you said, about applications. So what questions would you encourage those board members to ask?
Yeah, so I actually I've been to meetings where I see, board directors of multiple companies thinking about how they should approach AI. I think that given the low cost of experimentation and the high potential for upside, where you can place a bet at relatively modest cost at the application layer, and potentially, do something very valuable. I think having a way to think through and then execute on bets is an important part of it. And there's one other thing I've seen. While I think senior executives of companies will have many great ideas, I'm seeing as we work with multiple corporations that having a culture where you can have bottom-up brainstorming, not just top-down brainstorming, that's been really critical. So when we work with different corporations, we announced a partnership with AES recently, really great CEO, Andreas Glusky, but AI Fund will work with multiple corporations. And I find that sometimes the idea comes from the CEO, but very often also great ideas come from, people outside the C-suite. So having a expansive project brainstorming process to then identify and place multiple bets and then recognize some of them will fail. But if it fails, hey, hopefully the capital deployed was very small, but the successes, right, will way more than pay for a very small number of failures. So
I think that that's especially important with AI. I really agree, because we know from research, and Charter has done some work on this and others have as well, Kieran Snyder, the founder of Textio, which was a generative AI company from 2016, has worked on this, that different populations of employees tend to use generative AI differently and to different degrees. And so encouraging, women to use generative AI tools, they tend to use them less frequently. Encouraging older workers to use generative AI tools feels like we will get, this is one of these places where I think diversity will pay real dividends in terms of the breadth of experimentation. And really one way I think of it is AI is just a skill now. And it's a skill that people can become proficient in, and that will be differently proficient for different people.
I want to add one thing to that.
Please.
Of generative AI, one bucket of usage is using the web user interfaces. So if you go to the website of ChatGPT or the Gemini or whatever, type in the prompt, get an answer. That's great. That would give all knowledge workers, I think, that use it well, a meaningful productivity boost right now. There's a second bucket of opportunities, which is not using the web user interface, but is using the API calls to write software. So for example, I'm seeing tons of companies write RAG applications or retrieval augmented generation, meaning answer questions using our proprietary documents, or build many flavors of verticalized chatbots, customer service chatbot, food advice chatbot, travel advice, relationship advice, lots of verticalized chatbots. Seeing a lot of internal message routing. We all have too many messages in most businesses. Can we have AI summarize customer reviews or whatever and aggregate them and flag to us these internal text data processing applications? So I'm seeing a lot of these internal software applications or sentiment routing. Can we sentiment monitoring? Can we monitor social media for our people saying positive things or negative things about us? So it turns out for these software applications, there are tons of these applications that would have that used to take, me or good AI teams like 6 to 12 months to build, that because of new generative AI tools, there are now hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of developers in the world that can build on a week, maybe 2 or 3 days, what used to take me 6 months to build.
For those people who are those developers, are there tools that you think that they ought to be focusing on using?
So there's an ecosystem of tools that are arising from the LM providers, like the major LM providers, to companies that provide orchestration to help stitch things together. Things like, LangChain, Llama Index, Haystack, to the agentic AI platforms like True AI, AutoGen, LangGraph. So there are all of these tools coming up to use multiple large language models, multiple tools on top of them. And I think the software stack has become vector databases. So there's a growing ecosystem of tools that is really crushing the cost of building these applications. And what this means is, I'm seeing this very same dynamic as well. A few years ago, if it took 6 months to build an AI application, well, you better hire, do your user research, you're a product manager, make sure people want it. Then you invest 6 months, build it, and then boy, let's hope that high cost was worthwhile. But now, if it's so cheap to build a feature, I'm seeing teams go, you know what? You have 20 ideas for features. We don't know what's going to work. Let's build them all and ship them all. Yeah. And then you ship 20 features, 18 get no traction, shut them down. The 2 that survive, then create a lot of value. So long as we're being responsible, we're not shipping things that harm people, which really not, so long as we can do this in a responsible way, the idea, let's build a lot of stuff and ship it and then see what sticks, that recipe is being explicitly used by many more businesses today.
I think that's so right. It's sort of testing the range of motion of the muscle of experimentation, because you have everything from, I'll trial this in a prompt window on the web, to I'll use the web interface to make a custom GPT, let's say, where I, give it some consistent instructions, to I'll do kind of, Replit calls this citizen developer work, where I'll use some lightweight coding interface in order to create something, to a bunch of things that are not quite what the huge infrastructure or model making companies are doing, but are helpful with model management, the weights and biases of the world, Hugging Faces of the world, et cetera. And then all the tools that are helping with managing safety and ethical considerations and making sure that we understand, where bias results and all these kinds of things. I also just say, the other area where I see it is in almost every great software product I see that had nothing to do with AI. You have customer service software, you have invoice management, you have enterprise search. If that software does not begin to show its users really quickly that it is possible to integrate something that is driven by AI, usually by a large language model, into that service, it's probably a sign that you ought to be considering a different vendor. And I don't know, maybe we can think of some case where AI shouldn't be integrated into the vendor's software, but I think it's harder to think of the exceptions than to point at all the rest of them.
Yeah, there's actually one interesting thing I'm seeing in the marketplace as well. Because tools from OpenAI and others had made it so easy to build chatbots, there is a proliferation of chatbots on the internet, and people think, oh, integrating AI means I need my own chatbot, and
Chatbot.
that's right. And chatbots are fine, but and
Yeah,
many of
it's
them
one
have a lot.
thing.
There's a little bit of chatbot fatigue from some consumers, but it's fine. But there's one other large category. So for example, I'm seeing online bill payment websites where you upload a receipt and then there's an AI on the back end to help categorize, was this a
Sure.
travel expense or entertainment expense or equipment or whatever. There's a little bit of AI that just removes user friction and makes the user life a little bit better. And I think there are actually a lot of these things that are not chatbots, they're working behind the scenes that makes products better. And it's not the biggest win in the world, what the example I just gave, but what I'm seeing is when a company has a culture to execute on projects like these, those learnings then lets it go on to then, build the next bigger thing and the next bigger thing until hopefully it has something that then really moves the needle for the business.
I think that's really well put, because I remember when people used to say that 90% of the value of AI was linear regression. And as a former failed economist, which is to say not anywhere near as mathy as anybody else, it's like a line through some dots can be very predictive under certain circumstances. And so any technology that makes a prediction is AI in some sense. And you raised something at the beginning that I want to come back to before we open up to questions, which is you raised the kind of classic corporate buy, build, partner question. And I think one of the challenges many corporates are facing right now is an extreme version of a challenge they've faced for many years, which is, how on earth do I work with these startups? I can't tell which ones are real. Wow, if I want to acquire one, it seems like the prices are through the roof. I don't know how to sift through. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts on what the right corporate approach is for figuring out when to try and experiment and build yourself, when to use a vendor, when to partner with a startup, acquire, or however else you might think about it.
Yeah, I think on average, I probably see more businesses building internally than is completely optimal. I'm not saying don't ever build internally, but we've seen with the rise of the internet, just a long time ago, the rise of the internet means that many of us, all of us, can relatively easily have access to the best, right, HR software or whatever, just by accessing it on the internet. And so one thing I see with a lot of corporations is will often work with a company, brainstorm ideas, and then they go, wow, there's this idea. And candidly, if someone else already has that idea, buying it is often a much more capital efficient way to just get the benefits. Now, the problem though, there is actually one problem with this. When we work with corporations, one thing we run into very often is that we identify a need, but no one is supplying that need just yet, because the AI market is so new. I think many good ideas have not yet been, so there's just no vendor or no good enough vendor for it. And so when some of the partners, the dilemma is, do you want to build it in-house and kind of pay for it and be responsible for the maintenance of this entire thing, which can be expensive and burdensome? And and maybe one example, chatting with a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he said one of his pain points was translations. There's a lot of international business, really painful to translate stuff. So, but he had no desire to run a translation business unit to service their own needs. And in cases like that, it's worth considering if it's worth building a new startup, right? Or spinning out a thing, which is what AI Fund often ends up helping companies with, to build a product that serves the company, but so that the company doesn't have to pay for the entire development just to reap its benefits. But I think that the build versus buy, and then having said that, there are also some things that are so close to your core competitive advantage. You want to build it in-house, but I'll say, after talking to many CEOs, there are usually fewer of those than one might think. There are some, but probably fewer than one would guess.
Yeah, and I'll just insert one ad for the home team here before we turn over to Linda for the audience questions, which is, I'm surprised more corporations have yet to be LPs in venture capital firms. I mean, in our case, we have a single corporate LP. We don't invest as a quote unquote strategic investor. We just invest regularly. But the reason why Bloomberg does that is to have a sense of what's happening in the world of startups. And I think that working with venture capital firms can be a way to get a look across the ecosystem at once. It's its own skill. They're professional LPs. You can be better at it and you can be worse at it. But I think that's another way to create, it's sort of like one person described it to me as market research that might make you money. Because you're going to be investing your corporate assets anyway. And so that feels to me like another underused technique. And to be clear, we're not raising money from anybody else. So this is not about investing in us, but I do think it's something corporations ought to consider more often.
Now, it's interesting. Yeah, I've been on the CVC side when I was in a big tech company. I was in the IC and so on. So I've lived the CVC experience on the inside, and I think in moments of massive technological shifts, which we are going through now with generative AI, this is the time for CVCs to shine, because many C-suite and board count on the CVCs to go out, get the market signals, come back, help the mothership. And, when technology is mature, it's fine. CVC can make strategic investment, financial, fine. But this moment, this is the time that many CVCs can be heroes.
Beautifully put.
All right. Well, hey, we have so many great questions here from the audience. Let's answer some of them now. So now, first question, what decisioning criteria will help me determine if my use case is a good candidate for AI integration? Andrew?
Sure. Yeah, I usually run through two criteria. One is technical feasibility, in which if you can articulate the concrete use case, then if you can get some AI engineers to opine on, how doable is this? What are the resources needed to build this? And the second is really the business ROI, kind of the standard, how much work, what's the payback period, and so on. But when we look at opportunities, we usually run through technical feasibility and business feasibility. And if it checks both of those boxes, then may have something worth doing.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, this question is also sort of touching upon what you just answered, that this is a specific case where they're currently heavily experimenting with Gen AI and progressively advancing in its applications when it comes to reasoning, autonomous planning, tool using, and workflow design. Now, on the other hand, foundational model research seems to aim most human-level agents, or something that you call AGI. How do you evaluate these movement timeline? Is there a risk that a close enough AGI model disrupts and invalidates everything we've been building in the application layer?
So I think that if you can find a few AI experts to work with you, you may be able to make better forecasts about what may be in the proximate kill zone, of the large foundation model trainers. I do think that what large foundation models will wipe out is probably overhyped. I'm not going to say don't ever worry about it, but probably more people are worried about it than they strictly need to be. Because frankly, I wish it was that easy. Train a bigger model and have it do everything. I wish it was that easy. In fact, one of the most exciting technical trends I'm seeing in AI right now is agentic workflows, or AI agents. And what that means is, today, you can prompt a large language model to generate an output. And that's a bit like going to a large language model, or you can imagine going to a human and say, please write an essay for me on a given topic. But I need you to write the essay by typing it from start to finish in one go without ever using backspace. And humans, as well as large language models, we don't write that well like that. We can kind of do it, but we don't do our best work by, say, typing essays or even typing out code and just have it run the first time we type it out. So one of the exciting tech trends is agentic workflows, in which we will ask the large language model to say, write a draft of this article. Then think if you need to do any web search, and if so, go do some web search. Then write a first draft. Then read your own first draft and reflect on how you can improve it. Then revise your draft, and so on. And this type of workflow has an AI think about the problem, then improve it, then think about it some more and improve it. And it goes, iteratively to deliver a much better work product. And I think that this technology is actually doing much better than just prompting a foundation model a single time. And I think this, even as improved foundation models gets better, this type of workflow will be critical. And if you build complex agentic workflows, it will get even better with better foundation models. But I think most agentic workflows, I think it'll be, boy, I wish it was that easy that someone will build a foundation model to outcompete agentic workflows, I don't see that realistic in any reasonable in a reasonable time horizon.
And one of the ways that I think about this is if you are sitting there as a corporation thinking that I need to make a timing judgment, oftentimes it may mean that you're asking yourself the wrong question, because even professional investors make a portfolio of bets across different time horizons with different technologies. And so if the success of your investment depends on some point prediction about timing, you just may want to consider making other investments that, as Andrew said earlier, are so cheap and so fast to test, you don't even need to think about it yet. I mean, there's so much low-hanging fruit right now. Most corporations are not thinking, should I spend tens of millions of dollars on GPUs to train a new model? If that's your first question you're asking yourself, you're probably playing in the wrong end of the swimming pool, and you may want to partner with somebody who has some greater expertise. And specifically when it comes to AGI, I find it very hard to reason about it, because if you think there's going to be some wall behind which an unimaginable science fiction future will arrive, well, enough other things are going to change that we just kind of have to plan based on the slopes we see happening in front of us right now.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. And in fact, if a company does something today with positive ROI, maybe the technology shifts and they go, boy, we could have built that even more cheaply, but it's fine. You built it, positive ROI is still
And
running.
you're learning.
Yeah.
You're learning. I mean, in the same way that individuals have continuous learning, companies build these muscles too. And another way I'll put it is, if all your AI investments work out, you're doing it wrong.
Yep. So now this is a question for both of you about who should be driving AI transformation companies. Are companies better off giving AI to the experts like the IT department, outside consultants like Accenture, or giving paid licenses to many of their staff and just letting them figure it out for themselves?
Yeah, I have a strong point of view on this. I think that it is essential to spread the use of these tools in different forms with different interfaces and different tools as broadly as possible. Because people are bringing their own. I mean, we see so-called shadow AI already in the workplace where people use it on the side, and that's even worse for IT. And I think a big problem that IT and the AI model vendors and application vendors need to work on right now is, how do you satisfy the user's desire to engage in all of these tools without compromising the safety and security of the business? I think if there's a single corporate challenge right now, it's, every time I hear about a corporation sending an email saying, don't you use this thing, that's a dangerous thing that often comes from IT, and it's often from a valid security reason. So a lot of that has to be solved right now. That and the cost are probably the two real friction points right now.
Yeah. I would say every knowledge worker should be engaged. And in addition to that, for the company to do well, C-suite, especially CEO level driving and momentum makes a huge difference. It is really, it is in moments of change that leadership really matters. So smart CEO or smart C-suite that makes good decisions to navigate this change. I think that will actually make a big difference in the success of a lot of businesses.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as a segue, what should a CISO or CIO or COO look for when evaluating this ever-growing array of AI tools, which is now comprising like 99% of all tools?
I would say, I think, I would encourage companies to embrace many tools. And I'll just add one tip that may be a counterintuitive one that for managing that. The one thing I try to avoid when buying tools, buy a lot of AI tools, is to avoid letting vendors create data silos in my own organization. So where companies sometimes run into long-term frictions is you're a lot of vendors, but you let every vendor create a new data silo in your organization, and this makes it harder to control your own fate. But so one pattern I've seen is embrace the tools, go try a lot of stuff out, and see what works, swap in and out vendors, just go work with people that can help the company with tools and knowledge. But to the extent that the company is able to control its own data and not let vendors break you up into tons of data silos, that keeps you in the driver's seat for the long term.
Can I ask you a question about that, Andrew? Because I think that raises a central managerial question here. There's plenty of reflection in the press and by economists on the risk of AI taking jobs. let's sidestep that question for a second, or the risk of taking parts of jobs. Let's sidestep all of that for a second. Let's focus on just the managerial question of how do I encourage my people to experiment with something that they may perceive to be a risk to their own jobs? And I'm curious if you have any advice on that.
So I know I find that I know it's a tough question. I think that I don't want to pretend AI will have zero impact on all jobs, but I do think that for almost all job roles, to paraphrase my friend Kurt Langlois, it won't be AI replacing someone's job. It'll be someone using AI that replaces the job of someone that doesn't use AI. So I think that we can have candid conversations about why people are just more productive with AI. And if we look back over slightly longer time horizons, as labor, as people became more productive, salaries tended to rise to reflect that growing productivity as well. So I think for a lot of businesses, AI is a net value creation, and there will be a win-win-win for employees and for corporations and for customers. Again, now the tricky part is, it won't be like that 100% of the time. I think it'll be like that a lot of the time. And the fact it won't be 100% of the time does make it a little bit scary, which is why I think that the candid conversations, thoughtful corporate level change management, I think will be needed to navigate.
Yeah, and specifically around attention to career pathing for people who are impacted. And you can see whole industries of knowledge work grappling with this. I mean, the recent strikes in Hollywood really featured a discussion over how to negotiate this. We, in the aggregate, you're absolutely right. And whether it is 100% of jobs affected or 10% or 1% really just depends on timing. And I think one of the scariest things about AI for many workers is the unpredictability of it and the speed with which something can arrive that can wink a certain task out of existence almost instantly. And we have a way of thinking about it, which I'm happy to share, which we just use a simple analogy of a loom and a crane to say that certain technologies are, sometimes they call it augmentation versus replacement, but I think this goes even further. A spinning loom was a technology that complemented a worker at first, eventually replaced a worker. But if you look at what a crane can do, a crane with a worker can do a thing that a human being by themselves can never do. No amount of human beings given an infinite amount of time can do the thing lifting a rivet into the air 5 stories. And so the imaginative exercise, I think, for workers and for managers is to think, what are the things where it's not just making us more productive in the sense of doing our current jobs better, but imagining capabilities we never thought we could have that are only enabled because of this AI.
Yeah.
And maybe one other data point. When we do a task-based analysis of jobs, AI for many jobs will automate, 20-30% of it, and this leaves plenty of work for people to do. And with such a disruptive technology, if you're an employee, don't you want to embrace it and make sure you're on top of it rather than kind of stay off to the sidelines and then let it affect you rather than you drive it?
Yeah. So Roy, there is a question that came in for you specifically. This week, some VCs and research outlets started the 600 billion bubble thesis, mostly based on difficulties of monetization from consumer-facing services revenue. What's your opinion on this matter?
So this is referring to the amount of value generation that would need to be created to justify the aggregate amount of money invested. I would say if you're a LP, that's a really important question. If you're a corporation, you should hope that the LPs are blowing tons of money on experimentation on AI because you benefit from all of it. It makes everything cheaper and better for you. Now, that said, whenever any VC firm says something, I always think, how does that align to their investments and where they sit in the ecosystem? Because everybody is positioning what their story is relative to where they sit in the ecosystem. And so what I'd say is, yes, it is a very tall order for AI to deliver on the total amount invested. My guess is certain venture capital firms are going to blow up over making terrible investments, the same way that certain firms blew up over terrible investments in clean tech at the wrong time, to pick another thing. And that is not the most relevant question for a corporation or for a founder or for an individual investor. The most relevant question is, how can you find the things that deliver as much value as immediately as possible and pick the winners? I mean, this is a practice in experimentation and selection. And that's the muscle. Ultimately, the purpose of experimentation is not experimentation. It's prioritization and selection, and then implementation of the winning answers. And so I don't care so much in the aggregate whether it's true. I think it's a really good point. And I think if you're a corporation, keep praying that LPs plow endless amounts of money into AI.
All right. Andrew, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and I think just to defend Sakura a little bit, I think they actually asked a very good question, right? AI $600 billion question was the article. It was a thoughtful article. And I think a lot of their
Totally.
concerns that they raised, very valid ones, are at the capital in CapEx for foundation model training, spending money on GPUs, training foundation models. And I think as Roy says, unless your goal is to go compete with OpenAI and Anthropic and Google or whatever, most companies don't need to worry about that. I think a lot of this CapEx is at training the really, really expensive models. Fortunately, for most corporations, if your goal is not to compete with OpenAI, but to build applications on top of this wonderful infrastructure, then it's fantastic that others are spending so much money, which I hope they actually do very well on. I actually hope these CapEx investments will pay off. We'll see the timing of that. But I think that it's because of these investments that the cost of experimentation to build applications, as opposed to if you want to compete with OpenAI, can now be done in a very capital efficient way.
Okay. Well, so I have another question actually for both of you. Maybe we can start with Andrew first. Now, what might be a good strategy for risk-averse businesses to approach Gen AI?
So I think there are definitely businesses like, let's say, healthcare, where patient care is sacrosanct, don't do something irresponsible. While AI makes mistakes, I think the fears have been overblown. I've actually deployed multiple things in multiple hospitals, and we take patient safety very carefully. But what I find is that when we dig the details of the specific project, we can almost always find mitigations, like have a doctor look at it before we show it to a patient, or if we work in healthcare operations, we can schedule the MRI machine without really worrying because we're not directly involved in treatment using AI. So what I find is that many businesses, there is downside risk that we must mitigate against. But once you dig into the details, be it healthcare or financial service or something else, where we really have to protect against certain risks, I think the generalized fears have been overhyped, and the vast majority of time, we find mitigations or ways to take the product to market in a way that feels responsible and sufficiently safe.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it's precisely correct. We're going to be in this period where, in addition to judging the ROI of an AI investment, statistical concepts like recall and precision are going to find colloquial ways to make their way into business intuition. For example, there's a very big difference between relying on a mission-critical system. I mean, we invest in an AI company called Airspace that routes aircrafts. You cannot hallucinate the location of an aircraft, not okay. And so it's a very different kind of a system than something assisting with the first draft of a response for customer service, where even if it's only somewhat better than what you might have come up with on your own, it might be better. And so not all business problems are created equal. And therefore, the nature of the problem is going to match the nature of the affordances of the technology. And that's the way our brains are going to all start working.
Okay. Now we only have a couple of minutes left. So I would love to hear from both of you, basically, like, what's your wrap up or takeaway thoughts for today? We'll start with you, Roy.
I'll just say, I think Andrew made this point, which I love, that there's still so many areas where businesses want things and they don't work. One of the questions in the chat, and that's the opportunity for founders. It's the opportunity for internal builders within corporations. One of the things that we see, and somebody mentioned this in one of the questions, is that the AI models are trained on the tokenized English language. And so I'm traveling abroad right now and hearing jokes about how hilariously bad the responses are in other languages from some of the major AI models. And so that's just one example where the press in the US is not seeing that, and the UK is not seeing that. And so to me, this is less about what's possible and more about what needs to be built in order to make things possible. And that to me is where the excitement is going to be, I hope, for the next decades.
Andrew?
Just a point, I think thanks a lot for all the many questions you're asking. I'm sorry I couldn't get to all of them in time. I'm actually reading through them afterward as well, but just thank everyone who asked a question.
Yes,
I think takeaways, I think to companies, I would come back to one, get every knowledge worker onto Gen AI, but provide a little bit of training and thinking through security to make sure they use it responsibly and safely. I feel like most businesses should think through a task-based analysis of work to think where are the easy wins to drive value. And finally, in addition to the cost savings, I think let your organizations do an expansive brainstorming exercise and place multiple bets and learn from them, celebrate small successes, because I think a lot of industries will be, disrupted, transformed by AI, and having that thoughtful experimentation process to identify and place thoughtful bets, that can create huge upside for many industries while, avoiding disruption risk.
All right, well, thank you so much. So if any of you have questions regarding how AI can transform your corporation, feel free to contact us, going through Ellen or Andy. And you can note down their email addresses there or find them on LinkedIn. Now, thank you guys so much, Roy and Andrew, for joining us today for this program. Lots of great insights here. Now, if you have anything else to want to ask, feel free to still drop it in the Q&A, and we'll try to get back to as many as we can after the webinar is over. We work very closely at AI Fund with corporate partners and would be happy to chat further. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. We can
Bye,
be
everybody.
found on the internet. Reach out anytime. The conversation continues.